Willkommen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Einen wunderschönen guten Nachmittag nach Österreich, wo auch immer Sie sich in Österreich befinden, oder auch einen schönen guten Vormittag nach Island, nach Reykjavik, wo unsere beiden Sprecher zugeschaltet sind. Das Webinar ist in englischer Sprache, weshalb ich auch in Kürze ins Englische switchen werde mit ein bisschen Wiener Akzent, wenn Sie entschuldigen, aber ich wollte es mir nicht nehmen lassen, Sie zumindest auf Deutsch zu begrüßen. Mein Name ist Cosima Steiner, ich bin die Wirtschaftsdelegierte in Kopenhagen, zuständig für die Märkte Dänemark und Island, und Doing Business in Iceland ist unser Thema heute. So in English, welcome also to our two speakers in Reykjavik to our webinar Doing Business in Iceland. I'm happy to introduce Kristín Hafliðason, Project Manager from Invest in Iceland, and Garðar Vidar Gunnarsson, Lawyer and Tax Specialist from law firm Lex Iceland. And I do apologize also for not pronouncing your names very well. My Icelandic is not very good. But as Kristín and Garðar will hopefully also second in a minute, it is very acceptable in Iceland, also in a professional setting, to address each other by the first name. So Kristín and Garðar it is, and I cannot do so much wrong, I hope, in this case. I would like to run through the schedule briefly, just to give you an idea what the next 1.5 hours will hold in charge for us. So welcome in introduction, we're right in the midst of it, only very briefly from my side. Then we will have a 20 minutes presentation from Kristín from Invest in Iceland about doing business in Iceland, the economic business framework, also some regulatory framework, talking also about the economic development and what has happened just after the financial crisis, and actually how well Iceland has come out of it ever since then. This will be followed by a bilateral Q&A between Kristín and me. And when I mention Q&A questions, I would also like to let you know, feel free to pose questions at any point in time. You can use the chat function. I see the chat function, so we can either address these questions right after each presentation, or otherwise there will also be some room for a general Q&A after both presentations. So after this Q&A with Kristín, Garðar then will talk about taxation in Iceland, so the tax and the legal framework, again followed by a bilateral Q&A between him and me. And then, well, the floor is open for some further questions. If we don't manage to address all the questions, of course, also very welcome to contact us after the webinar, either my office, so Aussenwirtschaft Center Copenhagen, also of course the speakers directly. Before we get started with Kristín's presentation, I would like to do a quick survey amongst you. You will see the survey questions on your screen. Are you already doing business in Iceland? The survey is anonymous, so would be happy to hear if you are already doing business in Iceland. And then some further housekeeping things. The presentation slides, of course, you will receive after the webinar. You will also be able to revisit the webinar on our YouTube channel. And I've already seen, I already see that we have our replies in. So 57% of you are already doing business. 43% of you are not doing business. But of course, the goal of our webinar is to strengthen the ties you already have with Iceland, but also to those of you who have not done business in Iceland as of yet, to have a closer look at the small but very attractive island in the North Atlantic. So, but what you will also receive after the webinar is our Update Iceland, which contains a lot of information about the economic development of Iceland, and also about bilateral trade between Austria and Iceland and the business opportunities. I won't go into detail in this webinar because I would rather give more time to our speakers and on what they have to say, since they really join us from Iceland and are the experts in this case. So without further ado, welcome to Kristín Hafliðason from Invest in Iceland, who will give us his presentation on doing business in Iceland.
Like I was said, my name is Kristín Hafliðason. Everybody calls me Kitty. It was very, very true what she just said. The business environment in Iceland is definitely on a first name basis, and everybody in the world calls me Kitty. Only my mom calls me Kristinn, and that's only when she's mad at me. So please, Kitty, I'm a project manager at Promote Iceland. Invest in Iceland is a part of Promote Iceland. Been doing this for 10 years, and what we do is we promote Iceland. These are just basic facts about Iceland. A lot of our work is actually just tackling the misconceptions on Iceland. I mean, I know that you are from Austria, so you're fairly well informed, and you know probably could pinpoint Iceland on a map. I mean, it's a very large island, tiny population. We have our own language. We're one of the Nordic countries. We basically are marketing ourselves as a basic Northern European country, and it's not as cold as you might think. I mean, the low temperatures in January is about -5, -6, so it's not exactly what you think. It's a pretty nice island, and business-wise, it's a Northern European, highly educated country. Next slide, please. Well, like I said, we're part of the European Economic Area. We are a Northern European country. We are often thought of as one of the Scandinavian countries, though that's not correct, but it's nice. We like our friends, our Nordic friends. We have a very high GDP. It's a rich Scandinavian or rich Northern European country. And obviously, we have Europe as our biggest trading partners, and all in all, a Northern European society, highly innovated, like all Northern European country, innovated, highly educated, and with great physical infrastructure. Next slide, please. One of the biggest things to bear in mind when coming to Iceland is that the society is highly, highly innovative. One of the reasons is that it's a very small society. The home market is virtually non-existent. So we have to be smart. We have to think smarter rather than harder, and we have to look at the whole globe as our market. All of the companies that are born in the past 5, 10, 15 years are born global. They are thinking of the whole world as their market, and nobody's looking at the Icelandic market anymore. Another reason why we're innovative is, I think, just historically, it's a fisherman's island. We would go out in the morning, out on an open boat to fish, and we would have to bring fish back home. Otherwise, we would starve. So if things got bad, if there wasn't a fish, or if something broke, we had to come up with solutions to make that work. And we just had to. And that has kept in the psyche of the Icelandic people. So we have to innovate, we have to think in solutions, and we have to make things work. Thank you. Next slide. Like I said, a Northern European economy, it's the business environment. We have been thinking about strengthening the business environment. One of the ways we can do that is we wanted to make it as attractive as possible in the most and so we have the Icelandic tax system and lowering the tax. So today we have 20% corporate tax rate on a very, very simple system. So it takes it's not complicated to file for return. It's 20% on the bottom line. Next slide. one of the biggest things, one of the things that we are most proud of here in Iceland is that we can offer and we can live by and we can utilize 100% green electricity in Iceland, and more than 85% of the total energy that we utilize comes from renewable sources, either geothermal or hydro. On the electric grid, 100% of the electricity is from renewables, from geothermal and hydro. But let's not forget that for space heating, more than 90%, actually more than 93% of all space heating in Iceland is with geothermal hot water. And especially in the southwest, we have even geothermal heating for swimming pools and for street heating as well. So the Icelandic power market is highly attractive. And for power intensive or power dependent users coming to Iceland, you can get a long-term contract on more than one of these energy streams. You can have electricity, you can get steam, water, or hot or cold water for long-term on a very competitive prices. So power is definitely one of the biggest advantages of the Icelandic economy. Next slide. Well, based on this high education level, good infrastructure, Northern European economy, the power situation, we have prioritized our sectors, or what kind of sectors we are looking at to attract to Iceland. And there they are. We have data centers and life sciences. Tourism is becoming more and more interesting. Iceland has become on the bucket list of everyone and their grandmothers. And we need to invest in both tourism infrastructure and tourism leisure activities. And then we have the geothermal value proposition, which is basically geothermal power plants and having or introducing all these revenue streams to interested parties that might have a process that fits onto and utilizes more than one energy stream. So electricity, hot or cold water, steam, CO2, adjacent land, etc. So these are our sectors, these are our priority sectors, and we are promoting Iceland as a location for these. Next slide. Well, most of you know that during the fall of 2008, we had a slight hiccup in our banking system, where all the three major banks went belly up, and following that, we had a fair recession in our economy. As you can see, the GDP went from a positive high single digits down to minus almost 7%, and then 3.5% in the following 2 years. But we were actually pretty fast to turn things around. And now we have been experiencing fairly high GDP growth, and it picked up fairly rapidly, and we're at 7.2%. And the predictions are that it's going to stay positive for at least the near future. Next slide, please. And as you can see, the growth drivers, they have been changing a bit. I mean, in the past 15 years, we have been dependent on basically three industries. We have been dependent on the fisheries and aluminum, and then the international sector. Now, however, we have a major new sector of tourism coming in, and it's strength or its proportion of the Icelandic economy or the Icelandic export sector has been growing very rapidly since 2010. Next slide, please. Obviously, we as a highly developed nation, we need to keep our infrastructure up to speed. We pride ourselves on being a Northern European country with highly advanced infrastructure, and today we are looking at the multitude of different both private and public infrastructure development and projects. Next slides, please. Well, this is a question we often have. What about the banking system? How has it evolved after the crisis? So there are two banks in basic full ownership of the Icelandic government. The story about Íslandsbanki is a bit more complicated. It is technically in 100% Icelandic ownership. Maybe we will. Yeah, it's a bit technical, and I will be happy to answer questions on that if there are any specific questions on the technicality on the ownership of Íslandsbanki. Arion Banki, which was the biggest bank before the crisis, is actually held with both minority or active stakeholders with obviously the failed bank states, and then a minority share of the Icelandic government. The strategy of the Icelandic government is, however, to divest their ownership in the Icelandic banks to some proportion. Next slide, please. Well, these are this is a slide that explains one of the happiest news that we have had in a long time, when we actually lifted the capital controls. Obviously, during the crash, there was a lot of Icelandic krona that was outside of the Icelandic economy, both sides of the pond, and as a result, a lot of foreign currency inside the Icelandic economy. During the crash, or right after the crash, everybody realized that these krona would want to re-enter the economy in exchange for foreign currency. So there were capital controls set up to monitor these transactions. And then for the next 8 years, capital controls were in place, being lifted slowly but surely. And now in the early months of 2017, the capital controls are finally lifted for all persons, companies, and pension funds. Next slide, please. Here you can see that after the crash, the FX reserves in Iceland, they were not up to code. I mean, we were well below the desirable rate, but since basically 2015, we have been expanding on the FX reserves, and now we are in a very, very good state. So, and the outlook is still actually fairly positive. Next slide, please. As you can imagine, after the crash, the rating for Icelandic, or basically I suspect, I can't see the whole slide, but I suspect, and I think I remember that here we are talking about the Icelandic government bonds, a rating for the Icelandic government bonds, and obviously right after the crash, the rating plummeted and went down to near speculative grade. But in the past 2 or 3 years, we have been rising slowly but surely, and we are up to, or we're gaining momentum with both Moody's and Standard & Poor's. Next slide, please. As you can see, that ever since 2000, the Icelandic krona remained fairly strong but not stable compared to a bucket of all foreign exchange currencies. And then during the crash, obviously the Icelandic krona devaluated hugely, more than 106%, or yeah, roughly 106%, and have now since maybe 2013 have been gaining momentum, and is now almost halfway up to where the median was for the seven or 8 years before the crisis. So yes, we have definitely, the Icelandic krona has been gaining momentum. It has strengthened considerably since the bottom of the crash, but we are still nowhere close to where we used to be in the decade before the financial crisis. Next slide, please. Unemployment in Iceland has been historically very, very low. I mean, in the decade before the crisis, unemployment was hovering around maybe 2%. It went up to 3.5% in 2003. That was an anomaly. The average was about, I think the medium in the decade before the crisis was about 2%. Then obviously with the economy going, or the banks going belly up, and the economy crumbling, the depreciation of the currency being more than half, obviously it were hard times, and we went up to 8%, or actually these are annual averages. I mean, in few months we got into double-digit numbers. We have been fortunate enough that unemployment rate has been decreasing rapidly ever since the crash, and now we're at our old historical rate of virtual full employment. Next slide, please. The labor market in Iceland, we need to explain this because a lot of companies, big companies that are thinking about Iceland, they are obviously concerned about the small population, the small labor market. And because we are part of the European Economic Area, we benefit from the 4 EU freedoms, which is among them, which includes the freedom of labor. So when needed, and when we have big projects, big infrastructure projects or big projects, we have and we can import labor from within the EU, and we do. The local characteristics of the market, or the labor market, is actually very good. They are, or the market flexibility is very high. It's in American terms, they are employee at will, so the freedom to hire and fire is very high, and it's based on the Nordic model, where the membership of unions is very, very high, but the relationship between unions and the government and employers is friendly and not adversarial. So again, basic Northern European or Nordic system, but high market labor market flexibility, and with an ease of firing and hiring. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, that was it. So I have done my best to keep within the 20 minutes. Be happy to answer any and all questions. And I want to just thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation, and you're really perfectly in time. Yeah, let's do a quick Q&A, because some questions have come in, and already beforehand some of you have sent the questions in. Thank you for that. I would like to start. You showed us a graph about the development of the Icelandic krona, and just over the last year, it has appreciated by quite a lot. I think in 2016 it was around 9–10%, if I'm not mistaken, and already this year at some point up to 17%. The question is, what are the root causes behind this, and how does it affect the Icelandic economy, and what to expect? Will it appreciate further? Can you maybe comment on this?
Sure. The root cause is the root cause for the rapid strengthening of the Icelandic krona is obviously we were under capital control, so it could be monitored fairly easily, and the volume of FX trade was relatively small and still is. The cause for the appreciation in the past year or year and a half is that the tourism sector is becoming very, very big. All other exports have basically kept their momentum and kept their strength, with the tourism sector gaining huge momentum. Iceland now entertains more than 2.5 million tourists a year, with a population of 350,000 people. So with such a large influx of currency, and now with the until the early months of this year, still capital controls in place with very low volume of FX trade, it was very easy for large influx to affect the FX rate for the exchange rate of the Icelandic krona. Now, when it has gained momentum, obviously Iceland is no longer considered inexpensive. After the crash, and the valuation of the Icelandic krona depreciated by half. So all of a sudden, this rich Northern European country was no longer an expensive place. It was not cheap, but it was no longer expensive. Then now we are experiencing that, well, we are definitely not cheap. We have stopped being no longer very expensive and are back into being like our Scandinavian friends. We are an expensive place to live in. That has the obvious effects that has is that smaller export businesses and the smaller tourism businesses are struggling. So there will be some reshuffling happening with these industries, especially the industries that were born right after the crisis, basing all their revenue and the basic business model on a depreciated Icelandic krona. But then on the other hand, for the general public, they are just benefiting from a strong Icelandic krona, which means that prices are still fairly low, and the inflation rate keeping fairly stable. So two sides of the coin, but it's important to note, like I showed in my slide, that definitely have been appreciated. The Icelandic krona has appreciated, but we are nowhere near the state where it was a decade before the crash.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this. The capital controls lifted. Are there still some barriers that remain for foreign businesses doing business with or in Iceland?
No. The capital controls have been lifted on all persons, businesses, and pension funds. There are barriers, but those barriers are only on the offshore Icelandic krona that was present before the financial crisis.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. Also, I've received a question about the construction sector in Iceland. So, because Iceland is a small market, and the question was about the building and construction companies in Iceland with all the projects that are going on now. Is it mainly Icelandic companies who are building, or is it international companies that are engaged? And if so, who are the big groups that are active in the building and construction sector in Iceland at the moment?
No, there are no major foreign players in the building and construction. There are 3 major Icelandic players that own or are taking part in bulk of the construction. There are a few Northern European engineering firms that are subcontractors to these the large Icelandic construction firms, but everyone's welcome. We're part of the EEA, and to be honest, I mean, we are still playing catch up on infrastructure, housing, both residential and residential, hotels, and professional housing. So yeah, the situation is today that this is dominated by Icelandic players, but it does not have to be a rule.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And what kind of services does Invest in Iceland actually offer to foreign companies?
Invest in Iceland is a promotion agency. We are part of Promote Iceland. So we are basically a one-stop information shop for foreign investors. We promote the country as a location for investment, and we act on behalf of our clients, of the foreign investor, towards all the Icelandic counterparties. Mm-hmm. We are not allowed to take part in any negotiation, but we will get you into a room with everyone and anyone that you need to be with.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And we already mentioned the do's and don'ts, or we mentioned one do in Iceland. You can address each other by the first name, and I can call you Kitty from now on, which I quite like. Any other do's and don'ts an Austrian company wanting to do business or already doing business in Iceland has to bear in mind?
Well, Iceland is an informal, no bullshit kind of place. We address each other by our first name. Even the president, our old president, Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, everybody called him Ólafur. Our current president, everybody calls him Guðni. We wouldn't dream of calling him by his last name. That just doesn't make any sense to us. It's and like I said, it's hardworking, solution-oriented, but first and foremost, informal and straight to the point. And I think, well, I have to comment on this because we were actually in a group with you in the last Euro, and fortunately enough, we were able to beat you in football. And it was definitely not because we had more technical players or better players, or that the foundation for the Icelandic football team is in any way better. It's just that the Icelandic mentality is all about, okay, we need to work hard, we need to work smart, and we need solutions. We need to make things happen and no bullshit about it. And that's very, very important. This is what we've gotten, or a reply that we've gotten from our clients that have set up in Iceland. They are amazed of the resilience and the solution-oriented workforce that they get here in Iceland.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. So you will join us later for the final Q&A round after presentation. So yes. We are going to move on. Thank you very much. We're going to move on now and deal with some tax and legal issues. Gara will give his presentation on taxation in Iceland.
Thank you very much, Cosima, and thank you, Kitty, as well. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Garðar Víðir Gunnarsson, as already mentioned, and I'm a partner at Lex Law offices in Reykjavik. My practice primarily focuses on corporate and tax, both for domestic and for international clients. A few words about Lex. We are one of the largest law firms in Iceland. We employ 45 lawyers and aim to provide our clients with a full service, one-stop shop when it comes to legal services in Iceland. Now, if we go to the next slide and start the taxation, and my apologies, my slides are not as vivid as Kitty's slide with beautiful Icelandic pictures, but that's the nature of tax law, I guess. Now, as Kitty already mentioned, the Icelandic tax system is very efficient, and it's fairly competitive, and the corporate income tax is rather low in comparative terms, as we saw from Kitty's slide with the comparison of different OECD countries. The general corporate income tax for limited liability companies is 20%, and 36% for other company forms. But in Iceland, mostly, majority of the companies is actually in the limited liability form. Now, tax for domestic companies is levied on their worldwide income, less the deductible, which is the operating cost that the company spent to earn the income. And then we have possible reductions that are based on the applicable double taxation treaties. Now, for companies with limited tax liability in Iceland, which are the non-resident companies, the tax is levied on the Icelandic sourced income. And the non-resident companies are also permitted to make the appropriate deductions to that income, and the bottom line, as Kitty explained, is 20% income tax rate, but in some instances it is 18%. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'm just giving you a brief overview of the system. We have the value-added tax system. Now, the Icelandic's value-added tax law is from 1988. It was largely inspired by the Danish VAT law at the time, which again, and in turn was based on the applicable EU legislation in 1988 or at that time. VAT is imposed on all stages of supply of both goods and services, and imposed on imports as well. And generally, the scope of the VAT Act is very broad, and VAT is imposed unless it's expressly excluded by law. There are some entities that are excluded, and these are the government and some municipalities, and that's more of a domestic issue, and there are also some services that are exempted, and on the slide you see some examples of the exempted services, which is in line with what you might recognize from EU. These are financial and banking services, insurance services, health services, and so on. Now, some of the transactions, including the exports, they're considered as an exempt turnover. So it's effectively a 0% tax rate. But the taxable entity is nevertheless allowed to recover its input tax. For example, companies that come and set up factories in Iceland, they with respect to the exports, are allowed to register for this system, and can effectively, with respect to the exported goods, have a 0% tax rate as the turnover is exempt. Now, the standard rate of VAT is 24%. During the aftermath of the financial crisis, it went up to 25.5, but it's been it's been going down. We have a reduced rate that's 11%, and the reduced rate applies, amongst others, to food, the utilities, electricity, water for heating, etc., passenger transportation, accommodation services, etc. Now, even though the Icelandic VAT Act was inspired by the Danish VAT Act 30 years ago, it's not similar to that of the EU. So the EU VAT regime does not apply in Iceland. Next slide, please. Now, the recovery of input tax, that's pretty standard. The taxable entities are allowed to recover the input tax, and it's the standard input versus output tax, and the excess input tax can be reimbursed. However, it's only taxable persons that are registered for VAT purposes that are allowed to recover the input tax, which I will address more in a little bit further down the presentation. If we can have the next slide, please. Now, capital gains tax is 20% for residents. However, pursuant to the Icelandic law, capital gains, they're deductible from the company's taxable income. So basically, it's taxed in the corporate income tax level. There's also a special Icelandic deduction rule that allows a corporate shareholder, which you probably know as the participation exemption from other European tax regimes. So a corporate shareholder that's gaining profits or earning capital gain resulting from the disposal of shares can deduct the same amount, resulting in effectively zero taxation within the group. And the same actually applies for dividends as well, but there's a similar deduction rule applicable. This rule it applies as well to the disposal of shares by Icelandic companies in companies when they hold shares in companies that are established within the EEA, or the European Economic Area, and the European Union. The same also applies for European companies that hold shares in Iceland. They can get the same deduction with respect to the Icelandic taxation. With respect, and here's what I mentioned earlier, capital gains are taxed as effectively as corporate income tax, but for non-resident companies, the tax rate is 18%. And in addition to that, there is a withholding obligation, and when non-residents are disposing of shares held in Icelandic companies, they are subject to withholding tax. And as we will discuss a bit further down the presentation, there is a double taxation treaty in force between Iceland and Austria, but that treaty does not provide for any additional relief with respect to the taxation of capital gains. Now, if we let me see, of course, in other with respect to other jurisdictions, there might be further relief based on the applicable double taxation treaty. If I can have the next slide, please. With respect to individual taxation, Iceland imposes a rather high tax for in comparative terms. We have a progressive tax system here, and it used to be 3 steps, and it's now 2. So the first 834,000 kroner, they are taxed at 36.94%, and income exceeding this amount will be taxed at 46.24%. However, each individual is granted a monthly tax allowance or tax credit, which we call persónuafsláttur in Iceland, and that's in the amount of 52,907. Icelandic resident individuals, they are taxed on taxes levied on their worldwide income, less any relief that may be applicable according to a relevant double taxation treaty for income that's earned abroad. With respect to non-resident individuals, the same goes as with the companies. Taxes levied on their Icelandic sourced income, that is to say, income that is earned or obtained in Iceland. Again, we have applicable double taxation treaty reliefs as may be applicable under the respective double taxation treaty. Now, if we go to the next slide, we will revisit the issue of VAT and mostly with respect to the registration. And the general principle in Iceland is that anyone that carries out taxable sale of goods or services must register for VAT purposes at least 8 days before commencing of operations. And it's worth mentioning that construction work in Iceland is indeed considered taxable transactions under the VAT Act, and therefore it's advisable for non-resident companies that do not have a permanent establishment in Iceland, it would be advisable to appoint a VAT agent to handle the VAT documentation and returns, although it's not necessary. However, it's even though the system is pretty efficient and relatively simple, it's important that local advice be sought just to tick all the right boxes and keep it correct. Now, foreign enterprises that operate in Iceland, they can apply for the reimbursement of VAT paid in Iceland. If they pay VAT in Iceland for work here, they can and are not registered for VAT purposes, they can apply for reimbursement. And let me see. And that's a relatively simple process that the company needs to direct a application to the Directorate of Internal Revenue. However, in order to be eligible for such reimbursement, the enterprise in its country of establishment would need to qualify for VAT registration. So pretty much the yardstick or the criteria used in Iceland is that if that company would have been able to recover the input tax, had it been established in Iceland or present in Iceland, then it's eligible for the recovery. Now, the VAT, just some formalities. The VAT system in Iceland is based on 2-month settlement periods. So it's January, February, March, April, etc. And VAT is or the input tax in excess of the output tax is reimbursed the following month. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, there's a pretty recent double taxation treaty in force between Iceland and Austria. It was originally signed on the 30th of June last year, and was just very recently published in the legal and ministerial gazette in Iceland. It was the 27th of June of this year. So The treaty is in full force in Iceland and applies to the taxable parties that are doing business either in Austria or Iceland or vice versa. The treaty is it's largely or mostly based on the OECD model tax convention, and the existing taxes to which the treaty applies are the traditional income taxes and both the state and municipality in Iceland, and the income tax and corporation tax in Austria. Next slide, please. Now, just to briefly run over some highlights of the treaty. Business profits shall be taxable only in that state. The profits of an enterprise of a contracting state shall be taxable only in that state, unless the enterprise carries on business in the other contracting state through a permanent establishment. So we have the yardstick or the criteria is the company in question carrying out business through a permanent establishment in the other state. Dividends, according to Article 10, they may be taxed in both contracting states. However, the withholding tax, for example, if an Icelandic company is paying an Austrian shareholder dividend and the Austrian shareholder holds more than 10% of the share capital in the Icelandic company, the Icelandic withholding tax is capped at 5%, and that's provided that the shareholder is indeed the beneficial owner of the dividends. Generally speaking, in Iceland, the tax on financial income is 20%. However, as you see on the slide, it's 15%, capped at 15% in all other instances than those that when the shareholder holds more than 10% of the share capital. Next slide, please. Coming to interests under the treaty, the interest arising in a contracting state and paid to a resident of the other contracting state shall be taxable only in that other state where the recipient of the interest is established. Penalty charges or penalty interests are not regarded as interest within the terms of this article. And another exemption is that it only applies to interests that are determined at an arm's length terms. That is to say, the companies cannot decide improper or unreasonably high interest, which would not be applicable in a transaction between two unrelated parties. Royalties, Article 12. This is the same as with the dividends. The royalties may be taxed in both contracting states, but the withholding tax is capped at 5% if the beneficial owner of the royalties is a resident of the other contracting state. Next slide, please. And as all double taxation treaties include, there's a provision providing for the elimination of double taxation. I have put on the slide only that part of the article that refers to the residents of Austria. And as you can see, the most relevant item there is item B. And that's where a resident of Austria derives items of income, which in accordance with the provisions of Article 10 and 12, which are dividends and royalties, may be taxed in Iceland. Austria shall allow as a deduction from the tax on the income of that resident an amount equal to the tax paid in Iceland. So basically, it's a tax credit granted to the tax paid in Iceland in that particular instance. However, there are of course more provisions and that provide in more detail of the elimination of double taxation, but that would be too long and too technical to discuss further at this stage. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. There's some just to mention quickly, some implications for posted workers. That's Article 14 of the treaty, and the treaty states that wages and other similar remuneration derived by a resident of a contracting state in respect to employment shall be taxable only in that state, unless the employment is exercised in the other contracting state. So there's the treaty deals with the situation of posted workers, and stipulates some further conditions where you can see in the in paragraph 2, sub by items A, B, and C. Now, if we go to the next slide, there's some further issues with respect to the construction sector in general, and you can see there, which is perhaps the issue of most relevance here, is that in paragraph 3 it says a building site or construction or installation project constitutes a permanent establishment only if it lasts more than 12 months. And this would be a deviation from the traditional Icelandic rule, which would say 6 months. So the Iceland-Austria double taxation treaty extends this period to 12 months with Article 5. Now, if we go to the next slide, yep, and there's just the questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gara. Also perfectly in time, as we always are in the Nordics up here. Some questions have come in, and I would like to start actually with the VAT question, because that's my question. I read that VAT rates might be reduced in the anytime rather soonish. Is that true? Are there plans that to reduce the VAT rates in Iceland, or are there any other further taxes that are being lowered?
As I mentioned, after the banking crisis, the VAT rate went up. It used to be 24.5, went up to 25.5, and slowly but surely, as Kitty said, we've been trying to bounce back, and so it's now 24%. There has been some discussion, and there were some plans by the government to reduce it even further, down to 22.5. But as we're heading into elections in the end of October, we'll see what the new government will do. It's impossible to say whether or not these plans will be enforced or not.
Yeah, exactly. Quite surprising snap elections. Yeah. Then we have one question that is a bit longer and a bit more technical, maybe, but I think quite relevant for the companies, for a number of the companies that are in the audience today, and it does concern the principle of unity of performance and the principle of performance split. Because in Austria we have in the VAT a general rule which is called unity of performance. Which means that a contract which includes both supply of goods and also supply of services can only be VAT treated as one business case, either as supply of goods or as supply of services, depending which is the core performance of this contract. And no split of performance will be done in the course of the VAT appraisal. However, in other countries, this is not the case, and for the appraisal of VAT treatment, a split of performance is of goods and services has to be done, and no unity of performance is allowed. And the supply of goods will be treated separately for VAT, and the supply of services as well. Is this also the case in Iceland?
Generally, I would say no, as to answer the question directly, but the VAT Act uses both terms, goods, or the supply of goods and services. And the scope of the VAT Act is extremely broad, as I mentioned earlier, and VAT is basically imposed on transactions at all stages of the supply chain. And services have been defined as being a transaction that doesn't imply the sale of goods. So So generally, I would say no. But however, in Iceland, a taxable transaction that comes within the scope of the VAT Act is considered to constitute a taxable sale. So an invoice can indeed include both elements of supply of goods and services at the same time. So although the Act doesn't specifically address the issue of or the principle of unity or the principle of performance split, I would say that the general construction of the Act would be that the principle of performance split is applicable. However, just to come and elaborate a little further on this issue, which may be of a particular importance for or relevance to our attendees, is that when, for example, there's a turnkey contract made in, let's say that there's some machinery being supplied and installed in Iceland, and it's a turnkey contract. That would entail that the machinery is imported to Iceland and then installed on site. According to the VAT Act in Iceland, there's a special process for the imposition of the VAT of the imported goods, and that needs to be cleared, and that can only be cleared as goods and not services. And after the goods have been imported and the VAT paid in order to clear it through customs, only then can the service element be rendered and supplied, and then that part of the service or the invoice would indeed be the supply of services. So it's a little technicality when it comes to the import of goods, for example, in turnkey contracts, but nevertheless it's a quite efficient and accessible system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I guess we would have to look at the individual cases in any case.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One further question, I think you addressed it in your presentation already. Fiscal representative in Iceland, when do we need it, and do you offer it?
We do offer it. It's not a legal obligation, although it is advisable, because the parties and taxable entities that are supplying goods or services in Iceland are obligated to tick all the right boxes to fulfill their duties with respect to the VAT, and often the most easy course of action to avail themselves of the local formalities is indeed to appoint a representative, even though it's not mandatory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, as you've mentioned, thank you. Yeah. Also, with regards to currency, is it quite common or possible? I guess it is, but is it common to do business also in euros, or is it generally speaking Icelandic krona?
Generally speaking, it would be the Icelandic krona. However, companies are allowed to settle their accounts in different currencies, and they need to apply for the settlement in different currencies to the Directorate of Internal Revenue, and in the recent years this has been ever increasing, and with more international companies operating in Iceland and having interests in Iceland, and Icelandic companies expanding and seeking markets abroad, this has indeed become very relevant and not as uncommon as it was. So it's definitely a possibility, and it's a relatively easy process to obtain this permission, provided that the relevant criteria are fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. The reverse charge mechanism has been introduced in Iceland. You have it in Iceland. Can you just quickly explain, and are all services covered?
No, not all services are covered. As I mentioned, Iceland is not part of the EU VAT regulatory regime, but there is a reverse charge mechanism applicable here, and it basically is upon the import of services to Iceland. So it applies when Icelandic entities purchase certain services from abroad that are to be used wholly or partially in Iceland, and it also applies if a non-resident entity supplies services to an Icelandic entity that non-resident supplier doesn't have a permanent establishment or an agent in Iceland. So basically, it would be the Icelandic purchaser of the service that would be responsible for the reverse charge.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to what I mentioned earlier. If the reverse charge doesn't apply, if the foreign supplier of the service, if that entity could, if it was located in Iceland, register for VAT purposes and recover the input tax. So what the Icelandic company purchasing the service would need to do is it would need to ask the supplier of the services for a registration or a certificate of registration from the local tax authorities in the country of establishment where the supplier is established, and if that supplier would be eligible to recover input tax in Iceland, where it registered in Iceland, the reverse charge mechanism would not be applicable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Are there any other taxes aside of VAT an Austrian company exporting to Iceland will have to bear in mind? I know for certain excess taxes, I mean, alcohol, of course, there's a specific tax on it. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are also packaging taxes and certain environmental taxes. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Do they affect Austrian exporters to Iceland?
I would say generally it would not be something that's particularly Icelandic, and something that you wouldn't see elsewhere. We do have some excise duties and alcohol, fuel, and etc. We do have some environmental taxes for exactly as you mentioned, packaging and for the waste of the goods. So, but particularly Icelandic taxes, you wouldn't generally see, no.
Yeah.
But just to mention one thing, that would be there's a payroll tax that the employer pays. But other than that, I can't think of any on the top of my mind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Also a question coming back to reverse charge, because it just has come in. Is the reverse charge also applicable for the import of goods or only services?
No, only services. And only there's actually my answer was so long earlier, I didn't get to address. There's only certain services that would be applicable to the under the reverse charge mechanism, and that's basically, to put it under a broad category, it would be professional services, and I have the list here in front of me. It's very long, so I'm not going to read it out loud, but it's professional services of lawyers, accountants, advertising agency, sale and lease of copyright, patents, right, registered trademarks, etc. Mm-hmm. So there is a certain list of services that would come within the applicability of the reverse charge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah. One final questions maybe before we go into before we also add Christine to the Q&A session. It has less to do with taxation, but with the posting of workers and their registration. The question is, do workers that are posted that work in Iceland only on a temporary basis on a construction site or to install and so forth, is there an obligation to register these workers from Austria, and do they have to show their income as well? Is that necessary? And any specific rules and regulations before Austrian workers can work on an Icelandic construction site?
The Austrian workers can come and work, and if I remember it correctly, they just need to notify the working agency that they have arrived, and then they can. There's no formal authorization or permission process for Austrian workers. The registration of the workers, that's something that's done on a case-by-case basis, because it depends on the country of origin, but Austrian workers can indeed, under the EU, for freedom of the EU, can indeed come and just sign in and start working. As I mentioned earlier, Icelandic sourced income is taxable in Iceland, so that will in most cases, it depends on the length of or the duration of the contract and the nature of the relationship, or if it's a temporary work agency that has or administers the workers. So it's a rather complicated question that's based a lot on case-by-case basis. So I think I'll leave it at there. So I'm not saying anything that would not be true.
No, but just also from my side, for the company that posed the questions, we do actually have a Fachprofil, so a publication dealing with posting workers to Iceland. And a lot of those questions that you have in mind, also registration with the Directorate of Labor, should you bring along your employment contracts, what are the time limits, 10 days, 4 weeks, and so forth, are addressed in this publication. And also, of course, if you're thinking of a specific business case, we're very welcome to post those questions to us, and we will also research for you, and the answers we can give you right away, we can give you. And otherwise, we're very happy also to get in touch with the authorities there and find out. So certainly able to address those questions after the webinar. So maybe we should also invite Christine to join us.
Hey, I'm here.
Thank you again, Christine. Because I also have go right into it. We've received a question for you as well, again with construction activity in Iceland. You mentioned a little bit before, the question was there's a lot of activity in the tourism sector, but what about the commercial sector? So industrial buildings, logistics and warehouses, and also retail facilities and so forth. Is there just as much activity going on at the moment?
The short answer is yes. Following the crisis in 2008, basically all major construction was put on ice. So, and it stayed on ice for 4 to 5 years. So we are basically catching our tails when it comes to construction, be it retail, commercial, real estate, or residential real estate. We are catching our tails. We still haven't caught up with the needed construction, just to keep water, to maintain our level of in the economy. So it's definitely in tourism, but also in all other aspects of construction. Yes.
Thank you very much. One more question was concerning e-commerce. How popular is e-commerce in Iceland? Do Icelanders buy a lot online, and do they buy most of it in other European countries or the US? This would be one question, and the tax question afterwards would be: are there certain limits for registration when, as an Austrian online shop provider of goods, you sell to Iceland? But maybe Christine, you can answer first.
e-commerce, I don't have any official numbers to to back me up, but Icelanders in general, what I have seen, all the data that I have seen suggests that Icelanders, they do e-commerce, but not to the same extent as both sides of the pond in both the US and Europe, but we are rapidly catching up. And the e-commerce we do is both local and then to, again, both sides of the pond, both to Europe and the US. US is I suspect, because we as a country feel that prices are lower in the US, and Europe, obviously, because we are a European country and we are offered free flow of goods from within the EU. When it comes to taxes, I'm not the person. Please direct your questions in the appropriate channels, please.
Yeah, Ada, I think you are the appropriate channel.
Firstly, I would agree with what Kitty just said. You know, even though we don't have any official numbers, you know, or at least in my practice, I'm seeing an increase in e-commerce and clients asking questions about e-commerce. With respect to taxation, you know, it's pretty much with regards to corporate income tax, it's pretty much the same principles. If the company or the seller of the goods is located in Iceland, it's subject to the corporate income tax, and if perhaps the more relevant question is the VAT, and the VAT. There's been some changes in the regulatory framework with respect to it. It's tied to the supply of services, place of supply and place of enjoyment of the goods, and at the moment it's the place of enjoyment or the place of use that would be, if I'm not mistaken, that would be the relevant factor.
So there's no registration limit, in a sense that if you sell goods that don't go over a certain value, you don't need to register, but once you surpass a certain limit, you will have to register for VAT as a foreign or let's say an Austrian online shop selling to consumers, for example.
It's not that should be the case, yes, but this in fact it hasn't been clearly settled in the tax practice here in Iceland. It's where it's a little we're experiencing growth and some growth pains that go with it. It's a little bit of an uncharted territory at the moment.
Okay, thank you. One further question concerning the tourism sector for Christine. The hotels in Iceland, are they typically chains or rather small family businesses or smaller business or family run businesses?
The latter. The hotels in Iceland are predominantly Icelandic hotel chains, which in all global context is not a chain. Maybe a family of 3 to 7 hotels strung around the island. There are a few global brands in Iceland, but predominantly these are Icelandic entities, Icelandic chains.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, since I see that currently there are no further questions, I think we can slowly but surely come to an end of our webinar. But yeah, we are all here for any questions you might have. You can address them, of course, also after the webinar. There were some business cases that were a bit detailed, so I didn't go into those for now, but we can, of course, address them after the webinar and in the follow-up. As mentioned, Gada, Christine, I think we can pass your presentations on to the audience. I hope, yeah. And as mentioned as well, you will get our update, and you will also get our Fachprofil that will address also a number of the issues that were being dealt with, including registration of posted workers. You will be able also to revisit this webinar on our Aussenwirtschaft also YouTube channel. So will also you, Garda and Christine, if you would like to see the webinar again. Also in our follow-up email, you will receive a quality feedback link because we always like to hear how you did enjoy our webinar. So please, it's just a quick click, and I think you can choose between 1 and 5, and would be happy to hear back from you. And also any question, comments, what we can improve, and or what you really like, of course. Garda, Christine, thank you very much for sharing your insights today. Thank you for joining us from Reykjavik. I think for you it's just about lunchtime. Yeah. So do enjoy your lunch. I would also like to invite our Austrian audience, and I will say this in German now, as ein bisschen Werbung in eigener Sache. Die Außenwirtschaftstagung steht an. Nord- und westeuropäische Länder. Meine Kollegen und Kolleginnen und ich von den westeuropäischen, nordeuropäischen Ländern sind in den ersten 2 Wochen in Österreich, in den Landeskammern, und stehen dort für persönliche Gespräche zur Verfügung, also nicht nur virtuell, sondern wirklich face-to-face. Würde mich sehr freuen, Sie dort zu sehen. Wenn Sie mit dabei sein wollen, schreiben Sie uns einfach eine kurze E-Mail und ich werde Ihnen auch die Anmeldeinformationen schicken. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. And just one more thing, because you also mentioned that, of course, tourism is very popular. I'm happy to say that also Icelanders like to go skiing in Austria. So we do see quite a number of Icelandic visitors on our mountains. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And tak for i dag, as we say in Denmark. What is it in Iceland? What do you say?
Tak for okkur.
Yeah. I will not try to pronounce this. Bye bye.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. Yeah. Thank you. Bye bye.